Ms. Berman. There you are. Thank you. Oh, okay.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Brenda Berman of the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. I'd like to repeat some of the words and thank yous to Mr. Fiorini and Mr. Johnston for taking this on. We've all been working on this for a long time, and some of the issues keep repeating themselves and disappear, and then they come back, and you can tell we all care a lot about this. In looking at today's language, at least as far as I can tell from looking at it in the last hour, I would say that having a specific test is certainly useful, and I appreciate that. I think some of the tweaks that folks have brought up could be useful. In the first paragraph, 85021 of the Delta Reform Act, as others have mentioned, it talks about regions. It talks about regional self-reliance. It talks about regional investment, statewide investment, local investment. So underneath the language, one or more water suppliers that would receive water. For Metropolitan, that concerns us because we serve 27 member agencies. Those member agencies, in turn, serve over 300 retail suppliers. So when we look at this test, we think to ourselves, how would this even work administratively? Do we go to each of the 300 retail suppliers? Do we go to our member agencies and they go to the retail suppliers? Do they all go to their boards and vote and come up with some certification that they think they've passed either the purpose test or the three-part test? And how would they do that? On the other hand, I think you heard from some speakers yesterday that spoke about Metropolitan as a region, as an area, as a water service area. They spoke about Metropolitan's water stewardship rate, which is something we charge for every acre-foot of water that goes through the Metropolitan system. And that rate is used to balance out the region so that areas that are in a geographic position to put in more efficiency, more recycling, more conservation, can do that, and they are subsidized by the other users of water in the system. And on the other hand, those that can't and don't, they are paying in their fair share. So if they use more Delta water, they are paying more stewardship rate than someone else is. So when we look at this policy, and even under the definition that came out in the sixth draft, when we're saying you will reduce your net use, so I think here it says use, I'm not sure what the difference is. You will reduce your net use, so you'll reduce your percentage of water used in the future. And for Metropolitan, that's something that we have, that is something we have set our sights on for a long time. So we believe in the future that in 2010, we will use the same amount of Delta water as we will probably use in 2030. But when you look at Southern California, it will have grown. We'll put in local supply projects. We'll put in more storage so that in wet years we can take more water than we do in dry years. There'll be conservation, and that's how we will make up for growth in Southern California through the metropolitan service area. So when someone like Glenn Peterson spoke yesterday from Las Virgenes, he expects to use more Delta water in the future. But Metropolitan will not. What will happen is those supplies will shift. So maybe some more Delta water will go to Las Virgenes, but less Delta water will go to somewhere else that is using conservation. And we've seen that as our goal in moving forward. And so in looking at the first part, this first part of the test has been there for a little while. And when we read it, we look at number 2. That failure has significantly caused the need for the export, transfer, or use. And we don't really know what that means. And we've asked what that means, and we've told, well, just one person can't hold you up. Well, can 2, can 10? We don't know. There are 300 retailers that we don't control. We talk to our member agencies. That's who we're made up of. And so what I've proposed and what I've handed out to you is that we take away this test. Because what does this test mean? What you really want to know is if the entity trying to do something is being a good actor, is reducing reliance, and which Metropolitan absolutely is and is committed to. And so what I've proposed is that the first paragraph be replaced with one sentence. And that one sentence would be, water shall not be exported from, transferred through, or used in the Delta unless the service area of the entity proposing the action has adequately contributed to reduced reliance on the Delta or improved regional self-reliance. And along with that, I would change, in the 5th paragraph where it says water suppliers, I would change that to entity. And I think this gets to the heart of your test. It takes away some of the confusion of what the first paragraph means. And well, maybe some of you know what that means. We're certainly concerned about what a future council might think that means. And that is the number one concern from Metropolitan Water District.
On your suggested language, would the effect of this suggested language be to exclude any water contract executed by Metropolitan from application of the state law?
Could you explain to me how you think we'd be excluding ourselves?
No, I just want your intent. Is it your intent to exempt Metropolitan Water District of Southern California from the provisions of this regulation and the Delta policy adopted by the legislature, Section 85020 and 021?
No, sir.
Okay. So Metropolitan would be subject to these provisions?
Metropolitan certainly has legal opinions about whether the council has jurisdiction over that, but I think under this language...
So what you mean is this would help your legal argument to get yourself excluded from coverage under the Delta plan?
So that's not our purpose at all. Our purpose is to come to compromise and to come to a Delta plan that we can support. And while we certainly have our legal positions, we have consistently worked with staff to come to language that we think will work. And we believe this works. It's not in any way trying to exempt Metropolitan. It's trying to make Metropolitan the entity that you will review when a transfer happens or when water is exported or transferred through the Delta for Metropolitan.
And you want Metropolitan to be the entity reviewed or not?
Yes.
Okay, and do you wish to have that consequence immunize all the member agencies of Met from their own independent review? So that only Metropolitan would be reviewed for consistency of policy and the actions of individual agencies would not?
If Metropolitan was making the transfer, then we would say look at Metropolitan, look at its service area as a whole. If a member agency itself was making the transfer, for example, if Los Angeles was making an individual transfer, we would say look at Los Angeles and its service area.
So what you're saying is that if Met applies on behalf of your, I forget, 37, 8, whatever the number of agencies are, if West Basin's doing a really terrific job, that'll look awfully good, but it'll look awfully good for all of Met and not as good for West Basin because their actions will benefit the collective whole and they get no recognition for significant reduction in Delta use.
I think when Metropolitan is applying for a transfer, I don't know that West Basin's purpose would be to seek recognition for its outstanding record of conservation and recycling and water efficiency projects.
Okay.
I just have a
Joe,
question.
then Gloria, then Don.
My question is just why is it that you say unless the service area of the entity proposing the action instead of just saying unless the entity proposing the action? Because that appears to put some distance between actually saying the entity, Metropolitan, is responsible and saying, well, the service area has to do it. And I explain why it's written that way is all.
The statute talks about the region and regional self-reliance, so I was trying to find a way for the council to look at the region, which I defined as service area. You could take out those words, and I think the test would still work, or the paragraph would still work. I think the idea is to look at the area, and is the area on balance working with each other to make sure that these things happen.
Okay, I'm sorry, Ms. Gray, did you have a question? No. Okay, other questions? Pat? Randy? Don, I'm sorry.
Brenda, the language you suggested, then would it displace the remaining portion of the paragraph or just be inserted and then you'd still have 2 and 3 that would follow?
It would replace the first paragraph, the whole first paragraph.
Okay, so So where it said water should not be exported from or transferred, and then when that leaves off, then this would substitute for all 1, 2, and 3 then?
It is. You could add 2 and 3. I was trying to
That's
take
what I
away
was
from the
wondering.
confusion.
Again, I'm just thinking out loud here, reacting to what you handed out. That but in essence, you'd substitute this for number 1,
Right.
but you could possibly leave 2 or 3 in under.
Yeah, I would say 2 and 3 actually makes it more difficult. Taking away 2 and 3 probably makes it more difficult for Metropolitan. But it's a difficult test to understand. We've been looking for simplicity and clarity. I think one sentence work. You could certainly use my language to just replace 1.
Okay, okay. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Pat?
I read the service area differently from Joe. I thought it could mean that the actual use of the water in the area where the water is delivered would have to be delivered in compliance with the standards here. But that's not what you mean. You don't want to hold all of your districts accountable for their water use, or you're unable to. Maybe it's the other way. In your testimony, you said that agencies that can't and don't. They don't because they can't, or some of them can't and some of them don't.
Well, for example, Glenn Peterson yesterday from Las Virgenes, he spoke about the conservation and efficiency work that they started doing back in the 1970s. But as he said, they've really taken away the affordable options. They've done them. They've invested in them. They've completed them. They use all Delta water right now.
Well, this language, do you think that his agency, based on his testimony, if accurate, would be out of compliance?
No, I believe that under the 3-part test, that they have their urban water management plan. They've identified options for moving forward. The all word might be difficult, and they could certainly include things in their future plans that would look at those things.
So they'd meet all the tests, wouldn't they?
But Las Virgenes is a member agency. We have 27. And, well, I'm not sure how many retail agencies Las Virgenes has. Those member agencies span out to serve over 300 retailers. So
maybe we just take it a group at a time. The 27 member agencies, you picked out one that has a good track record, according to everyone's opinion. What about one with a bad track record? I know all your children are equal, but
Above average.
yeah. I mean, isn't the problem the ones who are the bad actors, not the good actors? Assuming there might be, just theoretically might be.
theoretically, hypothetically, in a different world, if there was a bad actor among one of the member agencies of Metropolitan, I would say that the region, Metropolitan as a whole, has still dedicated itself to reducing reliance on the Delta.
No, I agree with that, but isn't it also possible that you can only go so far as Metropolitan in compelling best practices? They're your members, they're your board, in a way they're your bosses collectively, and they have some independence, and they're locally elected, and they may respond to all of the incentives that you provide, which are many.
And to state law under their 2020 goals.
Right, or right, but they may not comply. Shouldn't the state interest be enforced by the council to make sure that they do as good a job as Met itself and the other agencies that do have a good track record? I
believe under this policy as written, if if this hypothetical member agency was a bad actor, that what you would be doing is penalizing Met and all 26 other member agencies by denying the transfer or denying the contract amendment. And whereas we can provide incentives for that member agency, and if it applied itself for a transfer, the council should certainly look to that and maybe perhaps deny the transfer. But to deny a transfer for the entire metropolitan service area, I hope it's an unintended consequence of this policy as written.
Well, how would the language work here? It's water suppliers that would receive water. Wouldn't you have to give them water?
But, for example, Metropolitan may complete a transfer so that we could add to storage. So let's say that storage goes to Diamond Valley Lake. It may not be decided until next year where that water is going to go. So hypothetically, I think you have to look at all 300 suppliers because you don't know where that water is going to go. Or at least hypothetically you don't.
So you have 27 member agencies?
We do.
And then the next subset are the retailers, and that's another...
Retailers, so cities, private, public.
300 plus.
And all of them have an obligation to produce urban water management plans?
I can't answer that. They certainly all have an obligation to follow state law. I don't know the intricacies of the urban water management plans.
So should the council and the state not expect districts that have an obligation to complete a urban water management plan then proceed to investigate which options are feasible and then go ahead and implement those when they're taking the state's water and water that would otherwise, that would flow through the Delta?
I think the Delta Reform Act talked about regions. I think the council has a responsibility to the Delta, and if the amount of water that's leaving the Delta or is being transferred through the Delta is going to cause harm in the Delta, I think that's within the council's purview. If the region as a whole in Southern California is doing what it's supposed to do and it's reducing reliance and it ultimately reducing its net percentage of water used, it's investing in conservation, it's spent over $1 billion in the last 20 years on storage, underground and above ground. If we're trying to do all the right things so that we can take more water in wet years and less water in dry years, I think that's what's important to the Delta. I don't know that an individual water agency's actions, I think where that affects them is whether they can apply for grants from the state. I think where that affects them is general peer pressure about who's willing to deliver them water and who's responsible for delivering them water. But I think other actors in Southern California should be allowed, and this is all hypothetical because we have no evidence that there are bad actors, but I think hypothetically those in Southern California should be allowed to make up for their neighbors. And a lot of them it's a geographic problem. Some it might be a financial problem. But as a region, they should be able to join together and integrate their planning and think ahead and say, how can we reduce our reliance on the Delta?
Okay. Thank you.